The rain hammered against the cracked pavement of downtown Chicago as a man in torn clothes, with a matted beard and hollow eyes, stood outside the glowing windows of Whitmore's Table, one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city. What none of the diners inside could ever imagine was that the shivering, homeless-looking stranger staring through the glass was the very man who owned the building, the company, and every plate being served that night. His name was Marcus Whitmore, 40 years old, worth more than $300 million, and utterly, achingly alone. If this story moves something in you, take a moment right now to hit like, drop a comment below, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still exists, and subscribe to this channel if you believe people deserve second chances. It costs nothing, and it means everything to us. Now let's continue. Marcus hadn't planned this. 3 days earlier, he had walked out of his penthouse in a daze, still wearing his tailored suit, after a call from his lawyer confirmed what he already suspected. His wife of 12 years was leaving him, and she had been for the better part of a year. There were no children to soften the blow, no family waiting with open arms, only an empty apartment filled with awards, magazine covers, and the deafening silence of success without connection. Marcus had built an empire from nothing, starting with a single food truck in Detroit when he was 22, and he had sworn to himself that he would never let anyone see him fail. But somewhere between the boardrooms and the acquisitions, he had lost every person who ever truly knew him. He wandered the streets for 2 days, unshaven, sleepless, wearing the same suit until it no longer looked like the suit of a wealthy man. On the third night, half out of despair and half out of a strange, aching curiosity, he decided to see what it felt like to walk into his own restaurant as nobody. Not as the owner. Not as the man whose name was etched into the granite outside. Just as another forgotten face in a city that swallowed people whole. He pushed open the heavy oak doors, and the maitre d', a young man named Tyler, immediately stiffened, already reaching for the phone to call security. The other staff exchanged glances, some smirking, some looking away in discomfort, as if his presence alone was an inconvenience they hoped would resolve itself. Marcus stood there, dripping rainwater onto the marble floor, feeling every pair of eyes measure his worth and find it lacking, when a young waitress stepped between him and the maitre d' before security could arrive. Her name was Hannah Doyle, 24 years old, with tired eyes that still held warmth in them, the kind of warmth that came from a person who had known hardship herself and never let it harden her. She had been working double shifts for 3 months straight, ever since her younger brother's medical bills had piled up after his accident, and she barely had enough left over some weeks to cover her own rent. But when she looked at Marcus, she didn't see a threat or an inconvenience. She saw a man who looked like he hadn't eaten in days, whose hands trembled slightly, whose eyes carried a grief that felt disturbingly familiar to her own. She quietly told Tyler she would handle it, and instead of turning Marcus away, she guided him to a small table near the back, away from the other guests, and without asking permission from anyone, she brought him a bowl of soup and a plate of bread from the kitchen. When the head chef questioned her, she said simply that she would pay for it herself out of her tips if she had to, because no one should be looked at like they don't matter. She sat with him for a few minutes between her tables, not because it was her job, but because something in her couldn't walk away. She asked him his name, and gathering the last shred of his broken pride, he told her only that people called him Mark. She asked if he had somewhere warm to sleep that night, and when he didn't answer, she understood the silence for what it was. Before her shift ended, Hannah did something that would change both their lives. She reached into her apron and pulled out $40, nearly everything she had earned that night, and pressed it into his hand. She told him it wasn't much, but it might help him get a bed somewhere warm, and that things had a way of turning around even when they felt impossible. Marcus stared at the crumpled bills in his palm, and something inside the armor he had built over 18 years of relentless ambition finally cracked. He was a man who had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without blinking, yet he could not speak past the lump rising in his throat as this stranger, who had almost nothing herself, gave him what little she had without a second thought. He left the restaurant that night, and did not return to his penthouse. Instead, He checked into a modest motel under a false name and sat on the edge of the bed for hours, turning the folded bills over in his hands, thinking not about his company, not about his failed marriage, but about the quiet, unshakable kindness of a girl who owed him nothing and gave him everything. The following week, Marcus returned to Whitmore's table, but this time in a suit, clean-shaven, unmistakably himself. The staff scrambled into a nervous frenzy, certain that some scandal or firing was about to unfold. Tyler nearly dropped a tray of glasses. But Marcus asked only one question: where was the young woman who had served him soup on a rainy night the week before? When Hannah walked out from the kitchen and recognized his face, the color drained from her cheeks, and she immediately began stammering an apology, certain she had somehow embarrassed the company by feeding a homeless man in the dining room. Marcus stopped her gently and told her the truth. He explained, in front of the stunned staff, that the man she had fed, the man she had given her tips to, was him, and that in 20 years of building his company, no employee, no partner, no so-called friend had ever shown him the kind of selfless compassion she had shown a stranger who looked like he had nothing left to offer. He told her that on the worst night of his life, she had reminded him that humanity still existed, that people could still be good without expecting anything in return. If your eyes are a little misty right now, you are not alone, and if this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Stories like Hannah's remind us that kindness costs nothing but can change everything. In the weeks that followed, Marcus did not simply reward Hannah with a bonus and move on. He learned about her brother's medical bills and quietly ensured they were paid in full, though he made sure it never felt like charity, framing it instead as a scholarship fund the company had always meant to create for employees facing hardship. He promoted her, not out of guilt, but because in getting to know her, he discovered a mind sharp enough to eventually help him reshape the company's culture from the inside, insisting on fair wages, mental health support, and a policy that no one, staff or stranger, would ever again be turned away from the door without dignity. Marcus also began showing up at the restaurant not as a distant owner reviewing spreadsheets, but as a man who wanted to know his employees' names, their struggles, their stories. Slowly, the emptiness that had followed him through boardrooms and penthouses began to fill with something he had forgotten he was capable of feeling: genuine connection. He and Hannah became close friends first, her honesty and lack of pretension a balm to a man who had spent 2 decades surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Over time, something quieter and more tender grew between them, not rushed, not built on wealth or rescue, but on the simple fact that she had seen him at his most broken and chosen kindness anyway. Before we reach the end of this story, I want to ask you for something small. If this touched you even a little, type the word kindness in the comments below, so we know this story reached the people who needed it most. A year later, on a quiet evening, Marcus stood once again outside the doors of Whitmore's table, but this time he wasn't hiding behind torn clothes or a broken spirit. He was simply a man waiting for the woman who had saved him, not with money, but with a bowl of soup and 40 honest dollars given from an almost empty heart. Success, he had learned, was never about the empire he built. It was about the one person who looked at him when he had nothing and still saw someone worth saving. And in a world that often teaches us to walk past the broken and the forgotten, Hannah's simple act proved that sometimes the smallest kindness can rebuild the loneliest heart.